In today's episode, Manjul and I tackle 3 questions about the costs of reading, especially we're talking about reading books. Why read when reading is worthwhile, what one should be reading, and when you have too much to read, what do you do about that? Manjul was interested in this topic because he and I have made different investments when it comes to reading. I'm more of a omnivorous reader who's reading books all the time, and he's more selective and making sure that he's making smart decisions about his reading. To ground our discussion for today, we read a couple of Substack posts, which we discuss in the beginning of the episode. Those will be linked in the show notes, and I encourage listeners to check those out. Our brief conversation is, of course, not the final word on this subject, but we think listeners will find it interesting nonetheless. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is reading. And we're going to come at it from a little bit of a critical lens. I want to think about the opportunity cost of reading. And there were two articles we took a look at quickly to kind of get ourselves introduced to this question. The first one was The Case Against Most Books by Richard Hanania on Substack. And his argument was basically that the cost investment for any given book that you pull off the shelf is just too high, and that there's other efficient substitutes. He has some exceptions to this, which we'll talk about later. And then there was a contrasting perspective, which is basically the idea that reading the classics is good for your soul, develops you in a humanistic way. And that was authored by a well-known cultural commentator named William Deresiewicz. And so today I just wanted to answer three major questions, essentially. And the first one is, is reading a worthwhile activity? Given the fact that there is an opportunity investment every time that you're thumbing through a 300, 400 page book that takes, 6 to 10 hours to read, you could be doing something else with that time. That's economically valuable. Second, if you are reading, if it is considered worthwhile, which a lot of people do, a lot of smart people do lots of reading, then, what should one be reading? And then finally, given the fact that a lot of people in professional jobs are required to do some sort of research, some sort of reading of some type of material, a lot of times they need to do it in a very short span of time. What are the best ways, most efficient ways to fill knowledge gaps when, the opportunity cost for wasting time on fluff is very high?
Sure. So just for our listeners, to boil it down, the key tenet here is opportunity cost. And Stetson, who is an avid reader, you read like 70 plus books a year. For you, it's easy to say that it's 6 to 10 hours to read a book. For some of us, it is much longer. So the key thing is opportunity cost. And ever since I learned about opportunity cost in my Econ 101 class some 10 plus years ago, I have been an unhappy guy in general. Everything has opportunity cost, If we think about it, the only real limit in life is time. Everything else can be earned in so many ways. You might win a lottery and get the money. And all we are trying to do is solve an equation for happiness. So happiness is an equation for everyone. We might think we're chasing money. We might think we're chasing health, but it's a balance. Ultimately, if you keep peeling the layer, the question is happiness. And for different people, that equation could have different variables, but generally has ingredients like time, health, knowledge, and other things. So we're focusing on why people read, I suppose, in terms of if it makes you happy, that justifies, because that in itself is a means. And in that case, we're not arguing, just to make it clear. So we're not even debating. If someone says, I get happiness out of reading, correct me if I'm wrong, Stetson, but that's my belief, is that then there's no justification needed. Anytime someone says, this makes me happy, generally justifications go out. But for those rest of us who live in a constrained opportunity cost world where we could be doing so many other things with our time, not just reading, watching documentaries, just going about doing other things that matter in life as well, is it like worthwhile to read old, new, thick books when the crux of it could be boiled down to essentially a SparkSnote essential version of it?
Yeah, you could essentially, you're outlining a more mercenary perspective on reading. I definitely say I would fall in the latter, the other camp, which is I read because it's pleasurable. I read because I enjoy it. I'm not necessarily doing it because it's the most efficient thing I could be doing with my time. I could be a lot smarter about it, a lot more strategic about it. So maybe I'm not the best about reading strategy, but the reason I read is that, I just enjoy the intellectual stimulation. I have this hunger for knowledge. I want to know as much about a range of different issues as possible. I'm big in science, big in literature, big on culture, big on history, all these different things. I would love to have even more constrained interests, because then I know that I could just pick this one topic and only read on that. But for me, I'm just like, I read because it makes me happy. But that's not the case for most people. Most people, like you said, have these constraints. They want to get something essential. What you find out of people's reading habits is a lot of times they're choosing self-help books or, kind of like fun beach reads, kind of, what
Fiction.
is, yeah, like a lot of times it's fiction. And, I think there's a lot of value in reading fiction too. I read a good deal of fiction, not as much as I used to, but it's still like kind of a 20%, 80% fiction and nonfiction, ideally. And, I think there's a lot of value. I'm happy to defend the value of fiction later. We can get into that in a few minutes. But I think for most people, they're turning to nonfiction and they're turning to nonfiction for a specific purpose. Like, they want to learn about investing, or they want to learn about basic economics, or they want to learn about some historical event. It may just be for a leisure purpose, but they want to learn something about a specific
Sure.
issue.
But of
And
course, in the last few years, there have been more and more tools through which we can learn. One I can think of, right, with the advent of high-speed internet in the palms of our hand, and the streaming services, which constantly pump out the quality of documentary, I would say, has only been going up, although here and there, of course, there are bad ones. That people could learn, for example, while doing some other activity, while being on a treadmill or in a rowing machine, people could still learn about the history of like what happened in World War II, what happened in XYZ part of the world in different era or different time, while being entertained
Yep.
and doing something else.
Right.
So like, has that changed anything fundamentally if to this question that we're addressing, where if we were addressing it, say, before 2010, 2005 versus now?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very important question. But books themselves are also multimedia now. Now, I don't
True.
know about you, but I make liberal use of audiobooks. So
Yeah.
the same time where you could be, watching something while in your exercise or whatever, I'm listening to it in my headphones.
Hmm.
So in that respect, like I'm just kind of doing that same thing, but it's books for me. And the reason I think the books are a little bit more valuable is you're getting a greater density of information, and you're typically getting fit from a lot of times an expert in that versus like you don't necessarily know who's putting together out a documentary. Usually somebody who puts out a documentary or a lot of these or a podcast or is either a non-expert or is someone with an axe to grind or a particular agenda. So there's oftentimes slanting, and this is not to say that it doesn't happen in books
I,
as well.
I was going to say exactly.
It happens in books all the time, of course. But the thing is, I feel like a lot of the times there's a passive consumption of something that you find on other multimedia televisual sources or just freely something you're streaming versus like you sit down and you've selected carefully a book. Again, it depends on like your filtering mechanisms.
And that would also go with any documentary or anything, especially in a world where the world or the stock market rewards for keeping people on the hook. So that requires pumping out constant material, new videos or new documentaries or new movies, which obviously quality could be compromised in such a case. Again, I would argue that also depends on your filtering mechanism. For example, I, for one, almost never watch anything unless it's recommended by at least two different people from two different walks of my life. And that way, if two different kinds of people or different people from different walks of my life liked something, I'm like, okay, maybe it's worth my time. And even then, it's hit or miss. And then, like, going back to your expert comment, even the article that you mentioned or the Substack you mentioned of Richard Hanania says that experts like everything, and I'm like, I like to think I'm an economist, or at least a student of economics for life. Like, I believe in the power of incentives. So if we look at everyone's incentives, what is the incentive of the expert? Is to pad their CV and resume, and no one has ever, I've never seen a resume that says 1,000 tweets published, but I've seen resumes where people have two or three books or five books published. So the world or system academia, and these are people from academia churning out these books, are being rewarded for books. And when people want books, so Stetson, I'm originally from South Asia. The movies, I'll take a quick digression here. Movies in South Asia used to be 3 hours plus long because people wanted full value. When they buy, they wanted to go to the theaters. This is back when we used to have to go to theaters to watch movies. So if the movies were short and cut to the point, people would be upset because what am I paying for? They're tying the money with the time spent, right? Not with the content gotten. Similarly, now I come back from my digression. These books we're buying, if they're thin, we will not pay premium price for it. We are a little bit correlating, like, and at least I do, the fatness of the book and the price have to be correlated. I would give you a homework on this. Of all the books you own, why don't you look at the cover price and the book and do a regression or a simple correlation and see what the correlation comes out to be. So
Yep.
then my point is experts do pad and repeat a lot, give multiple examples to drive the point home. And maybe that repetition is somewhat valuable, but at what cost, again, is the question.
Right, but if you're a judicious reader, you can still glean the value that an expert's providing, but skip over some of the parts where you can tell that it's something extraneous or something that's additional or redundant per se. I would also add that there's a certain level of prestige that's often attached to the size of a book, especially in terms of, at least in the literary fiction world, even to some extent in like the historical literature as well. This like plopping down giant tomes,
Yeah.
being able to produce that level of output is also something that's like it accrues prestige to the
Yeah.
individual. And also, if you brought up that point, your line about academics not putting 1,000 tweets or whatever their tweets on their CV.
Exactly.
The funny thing though is I increasingly like academics do actually do use social media strategies as a
Yeah.
way to accrue prestige, power, status, like
Yeah.
in their discipline. A lot of the times, it's kind of an outsider's path.
Yeah.
It's kind of a younger investigator's path or a younger scholar's path, but
Yeah.
you see a lot of it. I mean,
What does that tell about our topic then? Maybe academia itself is succumbing and kind of agreeing that maybe knowledge doesn't have to be disseminated in volumes of books anymore, because also another argument is that the world is so fast changing that like anything you write could be obsolete, and like I guess that's more incentive to sell new editions of the book. But storage and even like I mean I don't want to go a little bit, this might be a little bit out there, but from an ESG point of view of environmental friendly, are books the way to go in a world where maybe you actually having a book? And in fact, my dad is a book publisher. He writes academic like books actually on chemistry back in Nepal, where I'm from. His books are taught in high schools and colleges. And I know the incentives there too is to reintroduce, make some changes every few years, so that people are forced to buy new books, and that's not environmentally friendly. And if you can charge every reader for their fair share, maybe so many wouldn't be published, and that would be a path towards the right direction too.
yeah, I know there's so many competing tensions. The one thing too, at least when we're talking about very like academic type literature, there's a very, very small audience for those things. And in some
Yeah.
cases, like the audience is so ridiculously small, we're talking about, a few dozen people at most. And even then, like a lot of the people are not necessarily even like citing it or reading it carefully. A lot of like citations you see are like, either from like the legacy of like a certain lineage of scholars
Mm-hmm.
or a or basically people who attack the ideas, and so they're citing the idea because they're attacking it. And
Yeah.
that's sometimes the closest engagement you can get actually is when somebody is like a real ideological or just disagrees with you for some particular reason.
Yeah.
But
And just to dial it back a little bit, by the way, what age are we talking, right? Like you and I both have little kids. You have two, I have one, and we read to them,
yes,
right?
yeah,
In my case, I'm learning a lot because I did not grow up the same way my daughter is going to. These books are new to me, and
yes,
I enjoy reading anything from the Bible, although I have found a lot of holes in the Old Testament. Maybe we don't want to go there in this episode.
yeah,
Um,
right.
So, I especially wonder what you would, as a man of science, like how that reasons with you, but that's another digression. But also
Yeah.
the likes of Amelia Bedelia and all other books. So clearly there's value in terms of here with reading. Not only am I engaging her, but am I bonding with her? So at that point, I would argue, of course, like regardless of what we read, it's a means to other things with like all good. One of my philosophy professors in college used to say all good things in life are byproducts, like come as byproducts, and like so in those cases, like of course reading like has immense value. um, you tell me cognitively, like screen introduction, we have touched a little bit in the past in our casual conversations about how a screen introduction maybe isn't outright bad. It's the opportunity cost of what it takes away from, again, like so the topic really is becoming opportunity cost here of anything.
Yes.
So what do you think in that case, like the arguments that we're having, what age or what like subgroup at what point, like do you think high school levels people like are the like and on are is what we are focused on, or who are we focused on in that case?
Yeah. Well, I guess the default is like I just assume I'm like talking to an audience similar to myself. So I'm thinking about, younger people in professional roles, who, to have family responsibilities and obligations, but, have some leisure time to invest, maybe a book or two a month, I guess is what I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
certainly the opportunity cost is much higher for them
Yeah.
versus someone like, yeah, like a college students per se over a summer where it's okay even if you read one or two quote unquote useless books.
Yeah, no, yeah. If I was thinking specifically for somebody, on the younger side, bloom in the bloom of young adulthood or like early adult, becoming an adult, or just before it, I would say you should read, extensively as much as
Yeah,
possible, all kinds of different things. Hopefully, you have like some particular interest that guides you and that you're making smart choices, like use the resources you have. There's a lot of recommendation lists that you can use as a jumping off point,
yeah,
but I think it's an exploratory process at that
yeah.
point.
And in terms of gatekeeping, there's no institutional gatekeeping. I know 3 or 4 publishing houses control most of the publishing in the US, but we are in an age at the end of the day where people can self-publish.
Yes, yeah.
Although I would be interested in knowing statistics on like success rates of whatever that is defined as of independently published books.
Yeah, that's a really interesting subject. There was a really interesting piece on Substack recently about basically the economics of the publishing industry and how a lot of it, for the most part, the majority of books, they don't sell more than like 5,000, 10,000 copies
Yeah,
ever.
yeah,
And for the most part, those are basically the publishers taking losses, and
yeah,
that the real business books are the ones that are put out by some giant celebrities, and even those are hit or miss.
yeah,
And those are more in like the memoir or in the self-help genre. And then there's a big segment that is like children's books and
yeah,
classics.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it,
yeah.
and it's kind of a rough.
And I believe at least couple of the publishers are owned by private equity, so that adds a whole another layer of dynamics to like what is published and what not. But anyways, so did you want to move on to the
Yeah.
second of the questions or?
Yes. No, yeah. So to sum up, I think we've got to the core of why someone should read, and that's really kind of an individualistic question. Essentially, it's a personal question, and that they should have a purpose behind why they want to read, and they should understand that there are costs involved. Especially as we get older, as we enter into having more and more responsibilities versus
Yeah,
being.
yeah.
So answer that,
By
but yeah.
yeah, and this answer I think maybe even sticks to if we were to change to should one watch, right? Like
Yeah.
watch, like cost of streaming Netflix. I don't think the answer would be that much difference in terms of anything. You have to know the reason of why you're doing it. If it's happiness, you don't need justification. No matter time enjoyed wasting is not time wasted. I do believe in that. So in that case, if you enjoy it, that's your justification enough. But if you're doing it as a means to something, weighing in the opportunity cost and the best way to go about it. And now we get into like, if that's what you're doing reading for, is it to fill knowledge gaps or for other purposes? How do you go about it?
Yep. Yep. Totally. All right. So question number 2 then is, assuming reading is worthwhile in your particular case, what should you be reading? Now, again, because this is a personal question, I
Yeah.
guess it's a question for you. What is something that you want to read, or what have you read recently?
So for me, like I want to understand. So it's funny. It starts if I literally were to answer what have I read recently, it's not in my grasp here, but I've read the Bible recently for the kids version.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so from there on, I also watched this documentary on Moses in Netflix, by the way. So,
Yes, yeah.
so
Have you seen the
I'm
big? Have you seen that? There's like a really famous Moses story that like used to run on television all the time.
oh no, that I've not. I'd be interested. No.
So it's I don't know. It's really embarrassing. It's not on the tip of my tongue right now.
Oh,
But there's a
maybe
really
it'll.
it's the Charlton Heston story of Moses, I believe.
Okay. Yeah,
It's
I'll have to find that and maybe we'll revisit that another time. Um, so as I was reading that and watching Moses, I could not but draw parallels with the Hindu story of Lord Krishna. Lord Krishna was also a very similar story to Moses, and there's like parallels between this world, right? Um, and clearly, word traveled. I mean, again, like if we were to see why are the two stories at different parts of the world, different faith, similar or have very like similarities. So that has increased my like recently has increased my desire to understand history or origins, however you want to like put it, like from the beginning of time. Let's say God created. Let's go with it. God created Earth. Day 7, He took rest. Um, what happened from there on, right? Like, and to this day, I want to understand because and so to do that, I've been watching, filling up with documentaries. So by the way, in Netflix, I highly recommend the one on Ottoman Empire. So that's a good documentary I've been watching. So with my daughter being a contact napper, what happens is mostly I put on a headphone and turn on a documentary or a TV show during the days when I'm napping her. Um, so that's what I want to understand is my fill my knowledge gaps in terms of okay, what that happened there, Constantinople, that turned into Istanbul, all that, what happened then, and then like filling up to bring us slowly to the modern times and understanding, not in a rushed way because there's obviously so much nuance, but then I'm also watching a documentary on World War II in Netflix also. I do have other subscriptions, and we're not paid by Netflix, at least not yet. Uh, so similarly, then I want to tie it to the modern world and like go start reading, and that's where like I would actually be curious to get recommendations from you in terms of I do not have I work a full-time job,
Yeah.
and like we have a family to take care of and like spend time with on the weekends, among all the other hobbies. Like I play tennis, I play so many other sports. So basically, for me, it's a purpose in this case, like to fill a knowledge gap from a trusty source, but not just simply what are the main things that happened in 1850, 1851, because that's just like, I don't think is a productive use of time as well. Um, so that's where like a good summarized book or even a podcast would be good where I can make sense of it. And one thing I will go on a quick digression. I used to like think this and teach this. I used to teach SAT for a little bit back in Nepal, and I used to use the technique of mnemonics, right? Like so, like we already knew two languages. Anyone who was taking my course, so I was saying, why don't we? If we watch a 3 hour long movie, we remember every dialogue, who said what happened, and we'll remember that for at least a year or so, if not longer, depending on how good the movie is. We
Mhm.
read the same course book year in, year out. We're memorizing it for every exam, and yet we do not succeed, right? So clearly, learning or storytelling has stickiness to it. And mnemonics is in a way storytelling yourself, right? Like short stories and one of my favorite example used to be this word futile, which Puteko tile in Nepali means broken tile. Puteko means broken, tile is tile, like in English. So Puteko tile, useless, it's useless. And that like always stuck and boom, right? Like, so that, and like I was a pretty good SAT teacher, and like, so similarly, history is something I do think people don't necessarily need to read. There's one challenge I have reading. That's why I was like balking at when you said 6 to 10 hours for reading. Is like I almost have a sense because of my nature of work. For the last 5, 6 years, I am a buy-side investment analyst. Anything I read has a purpose to make money with it, use that information to make investments. So I do read a lot, but I read disparate things, tie them together, kind of like a mosaic theory, if I might, and then like try to implement that in the real world by buying or selling or shorting um, bonds or stocks of some certain companies.
Yep.
Those ones like require me to almost memorize facts or like take it slow. So then when I read for fun, I have a tendency to almost want to memorize the whole book, which
Yeah.
really slows me down. And I used Libby, which is, if anyone uses Audible, sorry Amazon, but you should check Libby out. And
It'd be great.
Exactly, that's same. I have the same one. Um, and so that has helped me not pause because I'm not going to pause every single time, right? I'm going to walk, I'm doing something. And like until my recent move from New York, I used to walk back and forth to work and I would finish a chapter of a book. And guess what? The summary automatically was whatever was made to stick. Another good book recommendation from my MBA days. And so like history is something like I will end my diatribe is the word. Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's contextually right.
Yeah,
But
so that is that rambling per se. On that, history is something I could listen to, but I also, even that has opportunity cost. So in that case, I don't necessarily believe that like I need to read thick books on history. Although, like, I agree, you could go every single detail, but that's not what I'm going after. I do not so much care what Hitler ate for breakfast or dinner as much as what he did and how his actions then are still maybe impacting the world today. And to do that, I think I don't need to read maybe 3,000-page books. Although someday, if I have time, I wouldn't be opposed to it.
Yeah, no, I understand. Like, I think my recommendation then is you're essentially asking for a broad, sweeping understanding of the course of recorded human history.
Sure,
And
yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of those narratives that exist out there. You can typically find them in all sorts of like general reader history books. The first one that like comes to mind immediately is Henry Kissinger's World Order. And he does, in part of that book, he explains essentially, I mean, it's more focused on like when the Westphalian system came into being. So it's not necessarily all of recorded history, but, essentially modern, a world history of modernity. And he provides basically a sweeping look at that. And there's all different kinds of perspectives that exist out there that you can essentially get in like an hour or 2 hours, and your understanding is an appropriate understanding, to work with on a day-to-day level when you're not like an expert in something. Now, of course, it's going to be a particular perspective. It's going to have its own slant. You might want to get like a second look to maybe have a more rounded view. But there's a lot of things like that. One of my favorite books, it is a big book, but it is a big history book, and it's called The Weirdest People in the World by Joseph Henrich. And it's essentially a psychological history of the West. And it asks the question, why is the West weird when a lot of the rest of the world is not? And the weird is an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, versus the rest of societies, which don't have all those attributes, at least all those attributes put together. And so the central argument, actually, if you want to really simplify it, is essentially that in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church decided to put a very strict ban on cousin marriage. And that ban on cousin marriage disrupted the kinship networks of basically European societies. And because they became more individualized, they needed to find other cooperative solutions to scale their societies. They had more and more population, but that population wasn't related. It wasn't local. It was diffuse and it was unrelated. So people had to start learning to respect strangers, and they have to develop a psychology and norms to do that. And so it's a really great book. There's a lot of really interesting ideas and stuff in there. And it's a broad perspective on like why, the West is the way it is. Now, this is one explanation. We've previously talked about books like Why Nations Fail, or, or Guns, Germs, and Steel, which are other types of explanations of why, the course of history went the way it was as well. So there's all these sorts of things. There's many different stories, and because they're constructed so persuasively, they will, I think, stick in your mind. Some of them are a big book, but I think pick two or whatever. The commitment, you can work through them in 2-3 months, over time too.
Yeah. So then, like one thing that I just thought of is, and this Richard Hanania, again, going back to the art Substack, talks about how no new idea comes on without the base of all the predecessing work, right? And yet we humans are each, in not just in looks and other things, but like in terms of thought, are different. Why do you think that is? Like, do people read different things and then interpret, like, is it a game of, if that is the case, meaning we go through different education system, but even within the same education system, obviously not everyone comes out thinking the same.
Right.
Are
Yeah.
we, is it because, and like I invoke your science background here a little bit, I guess, is it
Yes.
because the wiring, the neurological wiring we're done, that we are born with, that makes us absorb the same information? Like, would two people reading the same exact book, let's say two twins, like this thought experiment, read exactly same books all life and go about, would they come out with same conclusions and become similar in terms of thought?
Well, almost certainly no, right? Because so the way you're thinking about it is like you have basically the same piece of information, and then you have the perceiver, and right. So
So perceivement is different.
yeah.
The
So
difference lies in perceiving.
yeah, like people will perceive things differently in an essential way, and some of that is because of their biology, some of that is because of their
Yeah.
cultural upbringing and development.
Yeah.
There's many layers for why the interpretive process is different. But
Yeah.
even with us, like us seeing the world, like that's what we see. Me looking at you right now
Yeah.
is brain putting in an image.
Yeah.
I'm not really seeing you as is. It's a reconstruction, right? So there's assumptions that my brain is making about the photons that are entering my eyes, and so it's a
Sure.
reconstruction, and that's why we're susceptible to things like visual illusions, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you've probably seen many examples of them, like I'm forgetting like examples right now, but like
Magic for one.
yes,
Simple street magic.
exactly.
Streets of Paris for one.
Yeah, exactly. Magic is a great example, right? So we have, and I'm sure you're familiar with, the usual cognitive biases, like thinking fast and slow type stuff, the Daniel Kahneman thing.
Yeah.
So like the brain is not a perfect thing. Like we evolved, we have senses, and like they work in a very good way, but it's
Yeah.
not like 100% rendering in the world. There's too much going on, right? And we
Yeah.
even have it all the time. Like there's probably some noise or something that I've already tuned out, or there's certain things in my peripheral vision that I'm not paying attention to. And
So then I bring this up to see then, like, does it then matter what we read or who we read by, as long as with the same subject matter, because we are going to perceive it the way we're going to perceive it.
well, I mean,
Are
yeah,
there such thing as like, I guess, like on an extreme, this question could be posed: is there a thing such as truth, or is it everything is perceivement of truth, and hence where you get your truth doesn't like what are facts?
yeah. Well, I mean, I do think there's a real world, right? Because we can build, even though
Uh,
people are different, and like we do come to consensus about things, and we can make predictions about things that will consistently work and will work now and will work in the future. Like the theory, like our physical theories of the world, like are obviously pretty indisputable. Like somebody somewhere,
But
sometime.
not because it's consensus, because it is a fact. Like, meaning, if enough there's consensus on something that is factually wrong, that doesn't make it the truth.
Right. No, 100% I agree. I'm just saying like consensus is a sign, is a signal sometimes of the fact that
Sure.
like
Yeah.
there is something that we found in reality, right?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, just to be clear, yeah, of course, there's a real world, I mean, especially we both, like, I like to think you more so than me, but like I studied math, we're men of science, although like we believe, I mean, at least like I do, in terms of, yeah, there might be a higher power, and there's some faith that that is higher than even maybe like science, or this is a belief system, which may be a moral, ethical code that is essential also in our human life.
Yes.
But diving back to the topic was more so like saying different people are going to have different interpretation, because we're going to history, right? History, there's a saying that says history is written by winners and stuff like that. So along those lines is what I was getting at, in the sense that, does it matter who you like? It seems like the answer is yes from your perspective, that it does matter whose history you read, but clearly two people's history or two opposing sides' history are going to be or is going to be different nonetheless.
Yeah, yes, yeah, and that's what you're getting at is like the historiography, right? It's the
Okay, I see. Yeah.
yeah, it is like the phrasing of it is like people, or sometimes like a lot of times in casual conversation, people will talk about revisionism, right? So like there's a received understanding of a historical event,
Yeah.
right?
By the way,
People,
the time is running out, so I'm gonna just drop, and
we
we'll
can,
do a second of this.
yeah,
Meaning,
that's all right. So let's try and finish on our last point. Our second one, we we're a little bit all over the place. We got into all the things we're interested in, a little bit of history, a little bit of religion, all kinds of different things. But let's talk about the scenario where we have to read a bunch of stuff, more stuff than you could possibly cram into whatever given time window that you have. And you have to get a necessary piece of knowledge out of there and into an actionable, form. What are some hacks essentially to do that? You know, for me in my job, before I turn this over for you, I do a lot of basically quick perusals of various, pieces of scientific literature. And essentially there are already, standard procedures, standard approaches for how we need to get through these papers quickly to find the information that we want. Now, I mean, it sounds neat when said that way, but it's not that neat. So, the more papers that you look at, the quicker and quicker you are at getting through them. So obviously some of the hack is like developing an expertise in the type of texts that you're being presented with on a day-to-day basis. But I wondered, in your situation where you're seeing a lot of disparate stuff, I don't even know the different types of material that you're necessarily coming across. What are some of the things that you do in order to get
yeah.
necessary information on things quickly?
Yeah, so investment research, can be very you can keep going endlessly deep. So you kind of have to know like the Pareto efficient rule in a way, and see when you have enough, because there's so many things you could be doing with the time. Again, like dialing back to opportunity cost. So like, we look at numbers as a aid, in terms of the numbers are telling the story, and uncovering what are the key numbers when you're doing investment research. Like if you really think about investment in any one company, really what are the KPIs, what key performance indicators, right? um, what is driving the company's performance? Maybe if it's eBay, for example, maybe it's active users or gross merchandise value and the cut that they take from it. And if those three things is what I want to understand, I want to understand the story behind it and see if it jives with everything else I know about the world, right? Um, I always like to put, I think this is called market sizing, like in terms of, okay, there's this many people in the US. Does it make sense that 3% of the population is eBay buyer? I'm then completely making these numbers up, by the way.
Yeah, you do the back of
But
the envelope
yeah.
calculation. Do
And
these
then
numbers
you
make
think,
sense?
and especially in my case, I like to think it works because I wasn't originally from the US, so I have diverse set of people. And by diverse, throughout this podcast series, when I mean that, I mean diverse in terms of thinking, looks, beliefs, places of origin, diversity in the things, widest sense of the term. So I like, in a way, and now that we're doing this in Ohio, a quick adage, like a lot of sampling marketing used to be done in Ohio, apparently, because it's the representative for the country, they used to say. So in similarly, yeah, so like, so in my sample set, I'm like thinking, and this is just one example, of the 100 people I know, if I were to put a Facebook survey of like, hey, have you used eBay in the last 6 months, would at least 3 people say yes. That's just one like quick example of sanity checking numbers, like most of the times, like and then there's always experts and summaries you can read against, just like I guess in scientific there's always the sell side, which is the banks and publishing places that are selling research and are not necessarily investing themselves. That also sum things up. So that's one way. And then I was also thinking in terms of professional development, CFA exam is one of the hardest exam in finance. And when preparing for that is when you said cramming, that's what it, because when you're cramming, you probably are doing it for a means to an end. You're not cramming saying, oh, I need to know World War history by this age, unless it's for a test. So then in that case, there's always the usual, cheat codes, looking through past exam questions and seeing and trying to basically do reduction of, like I know people read like Kaplan, Schweizer, reduced notes, like on all that basically goes down to Spark Notes version, or like that's what I do is reduce the content to give me an advantage, which has always historically worked out. The formulation of it makes sense, but I can generally reduce, and this has been true throughout my academic career, is no matter what the course load or syllabus is, I can extract the juice and reduce it to within 20%. So when the key time comes if it's about memory or like recency bias per se or anything, I'm focused on the juice, that 20%, which makes me, I guess, 5 times more effective, which has led to academic success in the past.
Yeah, well, I guess though, then how do you identify the juice there?
So
what's
depending on yeah, no, fair enough. If the means is an exam that I'm trying to pass, like understanding the structure of the exam, like, oh, where is the option? If there's like, oh, solve 15 questions out of 20, then does it make sense to just reduce the syllabus and get other 50, focus on the 15%, not even study, like this used to be the case in organic chemistry back in high school. If I did not study organic chemistry, but I near nailed with 80% plus accuracy the rest of the syllabus, I would still do really well in the exam the way our exams were structured. So I just like passed on like organic chemistry rather than trying to hit and miss. So that was one approach, and others it's just like backtracking and finding patterns, seeing patterns in a way of historical exams to see, okay, this topic is really focused on or like LOS is what in CFA exam, learning objectives. So like truly understanding, do I understand this learning objective? And
Right.
those are more summarized bullet point versions of it. Last thing I will say during investment presentations, right? Like one thing analysts in investment community suffer from is what I like to call knowledge bombs. Especially
Okay.
early career analysts have done so much work, they have read everything to extract the juice, but they want to prove to the portfolio managers or their seniors that they know their stuff.
Right.
So they go on a knowledge vomit, which is not like useful for anyone.
Right.
So that's when like I like the method of 333, I believe it's called, or like that's how I remember it. I might have to go back check on that, but basically, human mind remembers 3 to 4 nuggets, like big, small, large, Starbucks, large, venti, grande, like, and then within that can have 3 more segments, so you can get up to 9 points across, and maybe person has some kind of retention capability, and beyond that, it's just like obfuscation or like confusion.
Right.
And all that. So like really these are the investment reasons. Like I like this because X, Y, and Z, X, and then go into 3 details in X, 3 details in Y. There's no more than 9 points to get across. And then let them ask the questions on the nitty-gritty. So don't go on the details on what the raw materials are and all the supply chain of any investment you're pitching unless asked. You are there, you are trusted to do the job. you are being listened to for a reason. You don't need to prove yourself by going into all those unnecessary details.
Yeah, that point reminds me of you're talking about quotes earlier. It reminds me of a famous quote. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. It's kind of it reminds me of which is that one's also often misattributed, but I guess it's a Blaise Pascal quote. That reminds me of like that's the counterpoint to what you're saying here about the knowledge vomits that analysts go off on.
Yeah.
It's like when you really know something, when you really have it down, you can, essentially give the elevator pitch, or the 3 bullet point summary or whatever it is of something essential when you're communicating something. When we were talking in the pre-notes for the show, I mentioned the meme or the clip from Margin Call. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but there's a scene where the main guy here, Jeremy Irons is playing him, the actor, and he says, explain it to me like I'm a small child or a Labrador retriever or something. It's like, yeah, I mean, a lot of times when you have these, when you're trying to bridge like a knowledge gap, you really have to simplify things. And I mean, that's, I think, one of the things we're going to try to aim to do with some of these issues. I mean, I've been jumped on.
And that is
There's been times where you've already used like acronyms, or maybe, I've done this already. It's like, or some terms, like you mentioned Pareto efficiency. I should have jumped in and said, explain Pareto efficiency to people.
That's fair. Like that reminds me, like, I forget where I, like, once you learn something, it's hard to remember what it was like not to know that thing. And
yes.
and because of our varying backgrounds, and that's what I think makes this a little more interesting than normal, is because we will be prone to that and we'll have to call each other out along this thing. And I truly believe that, like, if anyone really knows their subject matter or whatever they're talking to, they should be able to explain it to a smart high schooler. Beyond that seems like a stretch a little bit, but a smart high schooler should be able to grasp any concept of any profession, pretty much any profession. Maybe there are some exceptions, there always are. But and then if you don't, and we find ourselves using jargons and all, maybe that this is to say that maybe we actually have knowledge gaps in our field of and that exposing of that is also essential in terms of truly making yourself an expert in whatever field or subject that you are talking about. But on that note, any final thoughts on the third topic or third question?
No, I mean, I think we didn't provide, a complete total answer, but there isn't a perfect answer. I think we basically essentially said, find out what the highest value nugget of knowledge that you need to find, and find good strategies for identifying that, whether it is being, having, really deep familiarity with the type of resources you're looking at, or, just having some sort of strategy for, that it's going to be here, whatever it is. There are solutions out there. There's other things we can maybe talk about another time, but I think for the most part, we had a great conversation about, the importance of knowledge, and we touched a little bit on issues of, like, what is truth, all kinds of things that we'll get to later. We touched a lot about, our lives and things like that. And, there'll be a lot of interesting and cool conversations to have in the future. So thank you for joining me tonight, and we can just end it here.
Thank you.